So this is the fourth session in the series called Inverted. And I wanted to just quickly give an overview again of what it is that we're trying to address and what the goal is of a series of teachings. Each of us gives meaning to our life events by placing them in the context of a story. Your life story has a beginning, it has a present, and it has a future. And one of the ways in which we give our individual stories greater meaning and the structure by which we interpret our own life events is by placing it in the context of a larger story, or what I sometimes refer to as a meta-narrative. Now, this meta-narrative also has a beginning, a present, and a future. And it is hugely significant how we understand that meta-narrative, because it's the lens through which we view our own stories. Now, one of the ideas that we currently busy with, the first concept we introduced, and it's a concept that's believed by many. It's a concept that's integral to the way in which many interpret their own stories, is the idea of an original perfection. This idea that there once was a deathless Eden, and that somehow we fell from that intended, that original intention, and we're somehow trying to regain that original perfection. That concept of original perfection is what we are currently busy evaluating. Now, it's obviously hugely dependent on how we interpret the first few chapters of Genesis. And so in our last session, we began looking at alternative ways of reading the Genesis narratives. And significantly, the theme that we are exploring is, if we change the initiating question with which we approach Genesis, instead of approaching this text with the question, what went wrong, we approach it with the question, what makes us human? We look at the story as this development of the theme of how this human consciousness developed. It opens up a whole new world of meaning. And it makes it so relevant to you, because then it becomes the story of every human being. What makes you human? How does your human consciousness develop? Now, admittedly, there are many other themes. There are layers of meaning. This text has a lot to say about God and who God is as well. But I can't give all the richness of these texts in the 10 or 15 minutes that we spend in these teachings. So we are just pursuing one of the key themes of the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And that is this theme of what makes us human. How does human consciousness develop? Now, the first iteration of Adam, the first instance in which we meet Adam, there's not much that we have in common with him, because he has no parents. He has no history of relationship. There's not the complexities of emotions and interactions. And so the text is taking us through, step by step, the unique qualities that makes you human and how they develop in this earthling called Adam. And so one of the first themes we saw is the theme of language. Language, which is a uniquely human capacity, is on display. This ability of our consciousness to give meaning to our world. We saw another aspect of what makes us human, and that is relationship. As Adam, this earthling, is separated into Ish and Isha, the transcendent quality of relationship becomes apparent, a relationship that even exceeds his mastery of language, because it seems like he no longer has that mastery. His language even grows poetic in this encounter with another that is like himself. And when we ended off chapter 2 with that beautiful statement at the end that the man and the woman, were both naked, but they were unashamed. And so that shows us that there's still something about them that hasn't developed to the place where we can recognize ourselves in them. There's still this naive, childlike innocence. Somehow it lacks the subconscious. Somehow it lacks the depth of desire. And that is really what we're going to look at today. Chapter 3 introduces more of the qualities that is unique to our humanity. The qualities of desire and the qualities of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, traditionally, for many, we have read this text just as the text of a fall. Not everyone has read it that way, and that's really the alternative that we making available through these videos. But in this traditional reading of it being a fall, the story is quite comical, because you can imagine walking into a room of 6-year-olds and placing a box in the middle of the room on a table and telling them, hey, there are chocolates and sweets in this box that you have never tasted before. Now, I'm going to go and take a walk in the park, and I'll be back in a while, but please don't have a look in this box or have any of these sweets. You've just set yourself, you've set them up. You know that when you get back to that room, it's going to be open and some of the sweets are going to be gone, and no one's going to know who did it. And that's really what, in a way, what is unfolding in this chapter. The first prohibition is introduced: you shall not. And that prohibition seems to be absolutely necessary for the introduction of a depth of desire and an acquaintance with the knowledge of good and evil that comes about. But let's go to the text itself and walk through it more slowly. Now, one of the first characters that's introduced in chapter 3 is the serpent. Now, for many, when they hear the word serpent, they know exactly what we're talking about. It's Satan, it's the devil. Interestingly, the authors of this text had no concept of Satan the way we have developed it in modern Christianity. That idea was not even available to them. A book that I can recommend, and again, let me remind you, there are articles that accompanies all these audios and videos and teachings, and in them I reference all the resources if you want to study further. But the book is called The Good and Evil Serpent, and that book explores the symbolism of the serpent throughout scriptures, and it is surprising how much of the symbolism is positive. Jesus himself said you need to be wise as serpents. And so the theme of wisdom and the serpent is also going to be highlighted in this chapter 3. We ended, remember the last chapter, the man and the woman were naked. It's the Hebrew word arum, A-R-O-M. And it speaks of nakedness and vulnerability. And the very next verse, chapter 3, verse 1, it says, now the serpent was more, and we've translated it cunning or wise, but it's the word arum, A-R-U-M, a slight variation of the previous word in the previous text. He was more Aram than all the beasts of the field that the Lord God has made. Now, if the author wanted to emphasize the fact that the serpent was wise, there's a perfectly good and commonly used word within Hebrew. It's spelled HKM, which denotes wisdom. But very skillfully and artfully, he uses this word Aram to connect it to that previous word where the male and the female were both naked or vulnerable. And so I want to just draw, the fact that he draws our attention to that is very important, because vulnerability, it's a double-edged sword. There's two sides to this coin. We cannot be intimate without being vulnerable, without being naked. This vulnerability is what allows another to cross the boundaries of our isolated self, to penetrate into the depth of another being. And without that kind of nakedness or vulnerability, there is no intimacy. But at the same time, vulnerability leaves us open to harm, to pain. And it is this double-edged sword, there's two sides of vulnerability that is also emphasized in wisdom. Wisdom also requires a certain kind of nakedness or openness to new ideas, to learning. But to be open to new ideas also means that you might be open to learn things that are not that pleasant. Ideas that might even be confusing. But this is part of that vulnerability and wisdom, this symbolism that goes together. Now, the symbolism of the serpent, it's almost as if it is the personification of this exploitation of vulnerability that we're going to see unfolding throughout this chapter. Now, in the book, The Symbolism of Evil, I think it's by Paul Ricoeur, he beautifully states it in this way. In the figure of the serpent, the Yahwehs may have been dramatizing an important aspect of the experience of temptation, the experience of quasi-externality. Temptation would be a sort of seduction from without. It would develop into a compliance with the apparition which laid siege of the heart. The serpent then represents this passive aspect of temptation, hovering on the border of the outer and the inner. The Ten Commandments calls it covetousness. And that's in the book, The Symbolism of Evil, page 256. So let me read the text. This is Genesis 3 from verse 1 to 7. Now the serpent was more crafty, cunning, wise than any of the other wild animals that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. But God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some of the fruit to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves." So this story, I think, beautifully starts developing this theme of awakened desire. Now, René Girard's mimetic theory gives us a beautiful insight into the movement of desire and the way in which desire operates. Desire is not something that spontaneously just erupts between a person and the object of desire, but rather it is something that is mediated, something that is suggested to a person. And we can see that beautifully illustrated here. The woman doesn't just see the tree and immediately thinks the fruit is desirable. No, there's a conversation, there's a mediation, there's a suggestion being made. And the suggestion is based on a whole lot of implied ideas. First of all, the idea that you are not what you're supposed to be, that you are not like God, and that God is withholding something from you. Those little suggestions that communicates a sense of lack is what is absolutely essential to stir up and to twist desire. Now, this is very significant even in the development of every human being, because every one of us enters this world where everyone around us are bigger, stronger, they know more, they're able to do more than we are. And so we are born vulnerable. And we are born in an environment in which it is very easy for a sense of lack to develop. Can you see how this story could very well be the story of every human being? That along the line, along our development as children, somewhere along that development, a whispering voice comes to say that you are not what you're supposed to be, that you are less than what you were meant to be, that you lack something. And so that sense of lack that is introduced to us somewhere along our development sets us up to start grasping for something that promises to fill that need, promises to satisfy that need. And this is exactly what the serpent does. He says, God knows that in the day you eat of this fruit, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. In other words, to say God knows implies I know that God knows. And what the serpent then offers is knowledge instead of relationship. This fruit will give you the knowledge that God has. And if you can grasp and take hold of what He has, you will have it. You will have His being. You know that today that is how most of advertisement works. They don't just advertise the latest car or the next perfume. What they do is they put the best looking model there, because they know that what they are actually appealing to is your sense of lack of being. Now, you might not be that handsome model or that sexy model for the girls, but at least you can have what they have. And if you can have what they have, you in a way taking hold of their being. So our whole advertising industry knows the mechanics of desire that was so beautifully explored in this ancient text. Their intuitive understanding of how desire leads us forward. Now, very interestingly, it is only after this desire is suggested to Eve that the tree becomes desirable, that the fruit looks good, and it's desirable to contemplate on. We've translated here, it's desirable to make one wise, but one of the ways to translate this, it was desirable to contemplate on. And can you see how knowledge becomes part of what is so desirable in this fruit? Wow, I see we've done 20 minutes and we've almost finished the first half of chapter 3. I think we'll leave the second half, which I am so excited about. We'll leave that for another section. Please subscribe to the channel. Please share these videos if you find it useful. There is so much that helps us understand our own humanity in these ancient texts, and I want everyone to enjoy the benefit of that. Thank you. See you in the next session.